Good morning and welcome to the second Pimento Business Development Club of 2023. If you don't already know me, I'm Paddy Woods. I'm the director of Pimento Fuse and I also head up the marketing and new business for Pimento. If you haven't been on previous calls, and I think there's a lot of people who haven't, please use the chat box to ask questions, and we are also recording this conversation, so we'll be sharing the video later today or tomorrow. So today's session is all about exploring how agencies can build more effective growth from existing clients. It's by delivering better, more strategic relationships, which give a greater, longer lasting client tenure and a higher client return in investment. I know this is something that many agencies are struggling with at the moment, and which is why I've got two expert panelists joining me today. We've got Joe White, who is the sort of partner and founder at Team Sterka, and Emma Kelly, who is a relationship consultant at the Client Relationship Group. Now, rather than me talking about their bios, I'm going to ask Emma and Joe if they can give a quick introduction to themselves and the work they do to support agencies in this space. So Emma, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so hello everyone. So my name is Emma. I'm a consultant, as Patrick said. So I spent 18 years working in agencies first, running client business and running business development, and then switched over 7 years ago to become a consultant. CRC, as we're known, is an independent consultancy. We specialise purely on agency client relationships. That is all we do. And we work internationally with agencies across networks, across boutique agencies, across all the various sectors, with one aim really, which is to help agencies leverage client relationships to drive growth and to bring all that ingenuity, creativity, strategy that we see brought to client briefs into the world of client relationships. Ultimately to kind of mitigate risk and drive growth. So my role as a consultant, I work at the top of organizations with CEOs, helping drive change top down, and I coach and train more junior members of teams, so account management, on building relationship plans kind of bottom up. So we work across organizations, and yeah, that's what we do.
Excellent, thank you. Joe?
Good morning, everybody. Yeah, so I'm Joe White, and I'm a partner and a coach at Team Sterka. And essentially, I equip client-facing teams with the skills that they need to be both happier and higher performing. So I'm a trained coach. I'm a former agency MD and spent pretty much my whole career up until this time last year in agencies of one size, shape or another, both forming, growing and leading teams as well. So Team Sterka specifically is it's a training and a coaching business, and in a nutshell, we run a people skills program that has been created specifically for agencies by people that used to work in them, in order to provide everyone in that agency with the client and the leadership skills that they need in order to grow their revenues.
Brilliant, thank you. So it's great to have you both here. I think there is, as I said, we've got lots to cover, so let's get started. So Joe, I'm going to come to you first, and it's one of those sort of topics which actually would be really interesting to get your insights in terms of how valuable is the client servicing team in driving agency growth?
Oh, I'm so biased when it comes to this, but as the primary interface, so between a client and your agency, and hopefully as a team that, their purpose there is to retain and to grow clients, they should be incredibly valuable because they have that potential to make a real difference to your bottom line. If for any reason that function is reduced, they aren't performing, then yeah, putting it pretty simply, I would say you will be missing out on revenue opportunities. So yeah, for me, they are front and center.
Well, just to build on that, we've also got data on that. I mean, we at the heart of what we do is data. So we don't do anything that isn't fueled by diagnostic of some kind. And when we run econometric modeling on relationships, there is a link between high relationships, so advocacy, clients rating you 9 and 10 in an NPS type metric, and growth and margin. So it's actually proven too, I think, in terms of your point, Joe, in terms of the correlation between relationships and those people managing those relationships and the growth of an agency business. So yeah.
And building on that, Emma, actually, when you start working with an agent, how many of them are not properly realizing this growth opportunity?
I think it's quite mixed. I think I think some fundamentally believe in it. They fundamentally believe that relationships should be managed independently from the work, that they should be managed with intention. They're not a byproduct of great work, and some need a little more convincing. So I think a mix, really, but I think no one would disagree that relationships are important. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't invest in any of the work that Joe or I do. But I think some fundamentally still wonder if it's a nice to have, and then actually, what we hear a lot when we're working with teams on feedback is, if I just get this campaign out well, or I just fix the ways of working, then actually everything will be okay, which, we wouldn't always agree with in terms of what's perhaps going on in any relationship at any one time.
Okay.
I was just going to add to that, we talk a lot about the fact that, doing great work is one thing. Having clients think you're doing great work, know you're doing great work, is totally separate. And we say those things are, equally important. They're both part of your job role as a client service person, and they need equal investment of your time, because doing the work well is only going to win you half the battle.
Yeah, and again, just as another data point, just to prove that we're very passionate about this, but when we look at client ratings, so at the heart of what we do is a very simple referral rating from a 1 to 10. And when you look at what clients are talking about when they're rating 9 and 10, so these are the happiest customers, your cheerleaders, the easiest to grow with, the easiest to do business with, the easiest to drive stable, happy teams with, they are 3 times more likely to be talking about the experience than the work. So they're going to be talking about how it feels as opposed to the product. So they're going to be talking about how supported they feel, the levels of commitment and passion, the levels of expertise and shared kind of goals and alignment and partnership. So I think, again, just if one needs another data point, that would be one, I think.
And Emma, so in terms of that, so actually, how do you help agencies then in terms to get their client skills and their client agency skills to help get to that advocacy where actually it's about the experience and the feeling, not just necessarily the work?
Well, it starts with the feedback. I mean, for us, Joe will do it in a different way, I'm sure, but for us, it starts with feedback and a data point. So we ask a very simple question 3 times a year that creates a kind of ongoing feedback loop. And then that's just the start, though, because then probably what we spend most of our time doing is we're looking at diagnosis and looking at action. And the diagnosis bit is really important because a client may be rating a 6 or 7, and they may be having some niggles about, say they're saying something like, things are great, the team are lovely, but the reports are a bit late and they've had a few errors in them recently. So if that's a piece of feedback, there could be a whole course of action and chain of events that an agency then goes on to do, which is changing the ways of working late to get the report out, bundling loads more people on to quality check. And that may be the right thing to do, but through the work that we do with agencies and lots of the tools and things that we've got, we will get them to unravel that feedback and actually identify whether there's something underneath it. Because I think, as we all know, it's hard to say what we mean sometimes, especially if things feel a bit more emotional. So sometimes it might be underneath that feedback might be a sense that client has seen that agency's won a lot of new business recently. There's been a lot of press about it. They felt their team are a little bit less present. They can't quite put their finger on it, but they're feeling a bit less important, a bit less cared for. And frankly, they're under pressure in their own business. So it's hurting them a bit. So that might be the thing you need to diagnose an action around, that feeling of being less important or less attended to. That's probably not something a client's going to find very easy to say because it's kind of awkward. But actually, that's the thing you need to get to and therefore need to action around, as opposed to all that time and money you could have spent on something that was a bit off the mark, really. So we always start with data, and then we work with teams to really diagnose any pain points or any opportunities, of course. And then what do they want to do about it? How might they go about those conversations or plans? So that's certainly the way we help.
Brilliant. Joe, do you have anything to add to that as well?
I think Emma's covered it beautifully in terms of, the bit that we do in that is what we do is we give people the skills to be able to do that, to ask those questions and to then really listen and understand what the issue is with their client. Because I couldn't agree more. They'll say one thing, possibly actually pointing to another. So it's like, okay, how do you have the confidence to not just take that at face value and to in a very open and psychologically safe way get them to divulge actually what the what the real issue is, in order to then make sure, yeah, your solution is actually what's going to make a difference, rather than just running off in a different direction.
Yeah. Symptom versus cause, isn't it? It's the pulling the two things apart.
Mm.
And actually, Joe, you touched on the skills. What are the sort of skills, core skills right now you need as an account to get your account team functioning effectively?
It's the fundamentals, essentially, around building and maintaining strong relationships. So they need to know how to have an honest conversation, how to ask what may be seen as difficult questions. Sometimes we can build something up in our mind as actually, well, this is potentially going to be confrontational, it's going to be difficult. Actually, if you deliver that in a way and with the right intention, and the client understands where you're coming from, then being able to to do that, being able to challenge in a great way, being able to make suggestions, and absolutely being that sympathetic ear when they need. Emma talked to the point earlier that actually, a lot of the time our clients are under a ridiculous amount of pressure, and whilst they are our world, in that everything we're doing is for them, we're probably we're a smaller percentage of theirs, and so them knowing that that you've got their back, that they can trust you, they can be honest, you can have this like two-way conversation, though those real fundamentals, building a relationship, are the ones that are really important.
Brilliant. And I suppose in terms of then that sort of Emma, the most common challenges you face when you sort of pick up a new client and you're talking to the CEO, what are the sort of real challenges they come to you and say, we aren't performing or we're not doing? What are the reasons?
I mean, they are varied, as you'd imagine. I think that there are some common things right now that I think are causing a lot of pain, that we're speaking to agencies about most frequently. I mean, some of those are, how do I navigate constant change? Because there is so much volatility right now, I think would be the way I'd describe it, both in terms of the data, so how the data points are moving around from 4 months to the next with an individual client. A lot of client change, a lot of client movement, restructures, redundancies, new CMOs. It feels like some things can change very fast, and actually it would be easy to be complacent and say we've got steadily good feedback from our clients, we've got rich levels of advocacy, we're growing. Actually, the biggest danger right now would be to kind of plain sail on that, because as one global client lead in the network said to me the other day, all the people who fell in love with us at the pitch and we've been working with for how many years are no longer the people who are buying our work. I mean, and that's changed overnight. So we have to, it feels like we're constantly starting again. So I think probably the hot topic at the moment that we're speaking to the most is, okay, with that in mind, how do you stay vigilant? And that's through building a culture of feedback, not just running a survey 3 times a year. That's building a culture of these kind of conversations that Joe was talking about, and building a rigor around things like client mapping and man marking, around getting back out and in person, again, where investment allows, around having good conversations and fundamentally listening, because I think that's the build on Joe's point, is building a deep understanding of what's going on for your clients on a brand level, on a business level, on a personal level. So I think, having the rigor around account management and client relationship feels never more important when things feel so changeable. I mean, one network CEO said to me, I shared this with him the other day, and he said, I've never felt less certain about anything. I mean, there's just so much that's in flux and fluid, and that is the world post-COVID. I mean, we started to get used to it, and then that hasn't really changed in terms of the pace of change. So I think that's probably one of the most fundamental things right now. And the only other thing that springs to mind, which is quite specific, but in times of economic pressure, we do see value as a lens for everything for clients, and therefore we see a lot of, I would say, less tolerance for operational inefficiency. So I think that is a bit more on the functional side of things, but I think it has an emotional outtake when a client doesn't feel like the agency is shepherding their budget and their time as well as they might, when they feel like there's wastage, when they feel like there's time lost, when they feel like, even, new people leaving and, and onboarding not happening quickly enough, or 10 people on a Teams call and only one person having a role, suddenly those things become symbolic of, do these guys understand the pressure I'm under with my budget, and therefore are they behaving accordingly? So I think operational efficiency has become a very specific focus, I think, in response to the climate, the economic climate.
And I suppose this sort of question probably start with Joe, but come back to you. That operational inefficiency, that sort of has had a massive impact on retainers. That's been around for a long time. I remember running a pitch with Land Rover, and a big network, in fact Ogilvy, came in with, out of the £4 million pitch, 3 million of it was on account handling. You could see the client's face fell out of the almost through the wall and through the floor and disappeared. How do you manage that relationship, and especially when it's more project based, because a lot more agencies are having this, how do we want to go from projects to retainers? How do you go about doing that? But also, how do you manage a project and keep that relationship going for longer term?
When it comes to sort of planning for that sort of stuff, I think the biggest inefficiencies within the client service side of things can come from, that client pleasing at all cost pieces. So Emma's articulated there very much in terms of how that is viewed from your client's perspective, but from the agency perspective as well. Sometimes, especially if it's a big significant client, you're desperate to keep them happy. You can be investing time, resource into that, which potentially is going to be a little bit misdirected, because there may not be a big growth opportunity with that with that client. You might have maxed it. There may be circumstances for them at this point in time that mean that they just don't have additional stuff to be able to to spend additional budget with you. So and that that ebbs and flows in with clients, and obviously potentially depending on how much capacity you've got in your team. So certainly in one of my previous agencies, we used to put all our clients into one of three camps. So they were either it was a serve and protect job. So this if this client currently was maxed out at their budgets, had freezes, had whatever going on, we knew there was limited opportunity with them. Our job as a client service team was to serve and to protect those guys to the absolute best of our ability. So they got everything that they needed, and again, to Emma's point, making sure that from their perspective they had all the due care and attention without it being overinflated. We then had our second pot, which were our focus and grow crew. So these were the ones where actually we could see that there was potential opportunity, and therefore if we had any time or resource to invest over and above, we would. And then finally we had our supercharged ones who potentially were we managed to get a foot in the door doing something for them, but we knew that there was further opportunity for us to grow into that. And we'd review which pot they sat in, either every quarter, every 6 months, again depending how fast moving that landscape was that they operated in, or if they'd been changing personnel at that site at that time. If the client team had changed, that would be where we'd be like, okay, right, this is a big signal to us as an agency that we need to potentially do something different. And then look to make sure we spent our time where we could do the most stuff. But you were talking about inefficiencies there in terms of, I think on a more day-to-day basis, that's perhaps more planning on a wider scale. Day-to-day wise, more having unnecessary people in meetings, this over reliance on email rather than just like picking up a phone to have a quick conversation. That face-to-face piece, again, we get lured into thinking, okay, well, we'll just have a quick online meeting, that will save time, money, budget. But actually making an effort, getting out your comfort zone sometimes will mean that you are able to make a deeper connection. You're able to be more memorable with that client, and you can probably build more trust with them if you do invest in that face-to-face piece. So it's about picking and choosing where the best use of your time is. Does that answer the question? Felt like I went on one then.
I think so. And actually, I think there's some sort of, I think it's a challenge in terms of, I think a lot of the strategic capabilities of account handlers sort of started to drop as they became more yes men in that side of things. And there's a great question, which I'm just going to bring in from Stephen, which is actually, how do you teach and help account teams really spot those opportunities for extending the brief or even cross-selling opportunities? How do you go about helping that? And this comes into a bigger conversation, which is how do you develop the strategic growth plans, which is more than just taking people out for lunch?
Yeah, I'm happy to pick that one up to start with. That's helpful. I think it all starts with understanding. It really does. And that starts with conversations, and it starts with listening, and it starts with asking good questions. I think in order to have, you have to have a radar on, don't you, as a business development person, or as as an entrepreneurial account handler, you need to understand a client business intrinsically. You need to understand what they're driving for, what they're bonused on, what their goals are, what they're driving for, to make sure that it lands well, and it's not you selling your service. I mean, we see this all the time in the feedback. If there's a sense or even a sniff that the agency are following their own agenda and selling their products disconnected to client need, it's given short shrift in the feedback. So I think it starts with understanding, and then I think it's about understanding that growth is going to come from answering client problems rather than selling products and services. So I think a depth of understanding is ultimately the kind of foundation stone, and I think that has to be a live discipline, because things are changing and ebbing and flowing, as we've said. So I think that's the real key, I think, is agencies being restless, I suppose, and ever curious in their pursuit for understanding on ways in which the client may need help based on a deep understanding.
The listening bit there, and that's a big part actually of what we makes up our program. If you did nothing else but actually properly listened and understood your client, it would open so many opportunities for you. And typically you might have a sort of a relatively junior team, maybe with a more seasoned or experienced sort of lead, but then that person ends up carrying a lot of the load. So if there is something that needs selling in, or if there is there is a problem, and actually especially when they're stretched and they're drowning in delivering the day-to-day, sometimes it can be a bit more like, okay, all right, well, I'll focus on the delivery, and actually finding those opportunity pieces can then sort of take a back seat. And yeah, quite often we will find that an agency will come to us because they're looking to level up the whole team. Yeah, they don't just need one or two people to be able to have those conversations, to be able to spot those opportunities. They need everybody to be able to do that. And it comes from confidence. Yeah. Knowing the skills that you need to use, and then having the confidence when you're faced with maybe a big intimidating client, to actually say, okay, well, can you tell me more about that? I'm not quite sure how this fits into that. Just asking questions, listening.
I think measurement comes into it too, though. Just one other point is that, because one of the ways in which that we certainly work with agencies that is less about risk and more about growth is to identify where your biggest advocates are. So what we can do when we measure, of course, is look across a client, across an agency organization, and say, these clients are where you have active advocacy. These clients are more likely to buy what you're selling because they're incredibly happy with the agency, incredibly therefore open to having conversations with you about new products, services, brands, or even referrals into other areas of the business or into other organizations, or even following them as they leave client organizations. So I do think there's something in you get what you measure, and understanding where your advocates are, and then being very targeted is another way of using data, I think, to be very specific, and also to understand where are we excellent, where are we driving growth, how is that attached to relationships. So I think that part can also be helpful in terms of knowing where the open door is, I suppose.
And one of the questions that is around the listening side of things. I'm hearing lots of people talking about, so actually the junior people especially aren't very good at picking up the phone. They'd rather try and listen by email, which is almost impossible because the nuances are hidden. How do you go about coaching and building them, to younger people, to be much more engaged with picking up the phone and just having much more honest conversations through that sort of different styles?
I think that is training. I mean, like Joe, we've never had more conversations about specific training with agencies because, as one CCO said, we've forgotten how to people, was her expression, because to that very point, there's been a lack of social learning over the last couple of years. Everyone's been at home. There's been over promotion across the industry. There's a generational thing, I'm sure, as part of it too. So we don't listen with all our senses anymore. The non-verbal pieces has disappeared. So I think some of that is about good old-fashioned account management training and the stuff that possibly has also been a bit underinvested in over the last couple of years. And of course, as agencies go back into the office, albeit on a hybrid model, what role modeling can be done, I think, from people to kind of remind and refresh on, you know, what some of those brilliant basics are in terms of good old-fashioned client management, you know, communication, listening, all those things.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it never fails to surprise me in some of the training stuff, you know, and the things that we do. Our sessions are typically really short. They're like, you know, an hour, like once every 2 weeks with an agency. And we get people in, we give them, you know, the basic premise of a skill, why, sort of some of the theory part of it, but then it's very practical, and it's about actually getting them to put that into practice. So they're in breakout rooms, they're doing various bits and pieces, to actually to use those muscles and to articulate those words and to say, right, okay, you're going in to meet a client, you know, your deliverables are, you know, over budget, you know, they are, you know, they're delayed, you're going to have this conversation with them. This is what you know about the client. You know, how are you going to approach that meeting? Well, and, you know, and actually, you know, putting them into that scenario and making them think about it and using that time to actually to do it in a safe space. So then actually they can be like, okay, yeah, so next time I find myself in this situation with a client, yeah, rule number 1, pick up the phone. Do not attempt to resolve that issue, you know, over email. Even better if you can see them in person. If not, you absolutely need them on some sort of video call where you can understand their tone of voice, read their facial expressions as much as possible, because that's the only way you're going to resolve that. Well, it's the quickest, most efficient and effective way in order to resolve it. So yeah, maybe
that's the motivator as well as the training, because I think that's what we'd often say with some of our diagnostic frameworks. It's a 15-minute conversation ultimately to get to the root cause, to fix it quickly, as opposed to, you know, 25 emails or, you know, whatever it is, and you going around the houses to get to the solution. So maybe that's the other important motivator, is that point on time.
I think it all goes back to the pressure. Actually, CMOs and heads of marketing, they're under pressure, and having an email conversation, which actually could be taken over 15 minutes, will solve a lot of that pressure that they face. And just going back to this question, another question from Stephen before I jump into other questions, which is around actually, how do you train and coach younger account handlers to understand the nuance of a client's business, to really get to understand the strategic opportunity and build out sort of a much broader approach, so that they have got the basic skills, but they've also got the broader skills to actually help that client more effectively?
I mean, it's a great question. I think understanding operates on 3 levels. Firstly, I would say, so again, a data point on active advocates, they talk about they understand me on a personal level, they understand my brand, they understand my business. So I think understanding operates on 3 levels. And that's what we're often kind of teasing out in terms of where understanding may be a barrier. I mean, I'm inclined to answer, get your clients to help with this, because I think that there's only so much you can do alone. And again, when we've looked at and we've done studies on good client practice, because we also run internal diagnostics on how teams feel about working on their clients. And, you know, again, the happiest teams, therefore the most stable teams, are often talking about client transparency and openness, you know, and willingness to collaborate and share, frankly. So there may be something in more joint initiatives with clients, and very often we're pushing for, you know, adult to adult, mutually rewarding relationships. So I suppose my provocation will be, where can clients help you build this? You know, what's possible in terms of building a program with them, with a win-win of having a very kind of expert team of knowledgeable people around your business. So that may well be an opportunity that may already be tapped into or may not be. But also like bottling that stuff, because the thing that's really, really irritates clients is when they invest in stuff like this and then it gets lost the minute that person walks out the door. So I think also, where do you create a kind of a center of excellence for all this stuff, where it all lives, a repository where as new people come in, they can tap into that too. So I think that's probably the second important point of what you do with that intel, where it goes and how it travels and lives within the organization as people move around, is critical.
And actually building on that, taking all that information, actually, how do you go about building those growth plans, that intel, that insight that's going to help the agency from a revenue, but also actually from a client relationship perspective? How do you go about really building the framework for that success, so that everyone in the agency is invested, understands, and it can be invested? So if that client person is hit, touch wood, isn't hit by a bus, but is off sick, someone can pick up those reins.
I would connect the two. So what we're often advocating for and have kind of models for is having, obviously you'd have your growth plan for the business, and then the relationship plan should sit underneath it and should be enabling it. What we're often asking agencies is, what objectives and outcomes are you driving this year, and how are your relationships going to enable that or going to get in the way of that? So the two should be absolutely tightly connected, and tracked accordingly. So I think that's the first thing. And then I think on the relational side of things, which is obviously where we're most focused, we have a very simple 3-part model that looks at the relationship on 3 lenses. So, what's the relationship state of play? Whether you've got a measurement tool to do that or not, what's the relationship state of play? How is that going to enable our goals or not? Who do we need to build a relationship with? Why are we not? All those kind of good things. Transactionally, so or more functionally, what do we need to do to unlock our growth plan? So there might be something around the work, the processes, it might be around the strategy, whatever it may be. And then thirdly, which is often most missed, I think, but is really important, is what is the mindset or narrative on this piece of business, which is going to help us unlock that growth or not? Because very often, and again, we measure all this stuff with agencies, there can be a narrative around a piece of business that may exist within the client or the agency. Let's pick the agency. It may be this client is the client. We'll never do innovative work with this client. It's just not going to happen. They never buy this kind of work. And the minute that story, because it is a story, but takes root, that informs everyone's view, and it carries on through the agency organization. It kind of taints new people's perspectives, and you may find that there's a mindset or a narrative that is going to fundamentally be a barrier to your growth, and that's what you also need to diagnose and address. So and equally, that may be a fixed mindset around something within the agency, or it may be a narrative within the client organization you've really got to oversteer on. This agency aren't great at digital. This agency are only good with big clients. This agency, are not innovative in their thinking. They're a bit tried and a bit staid after 5 years of working with us, whatever those things may be. And again, so I think it's really important to identify are there any mindsets or narratives which also need some kind of breaking down and dismantling or unlearning, depending on what it is. But absolutely, I think fundamentally it's bringing the two together.
I love that, Emma. And we used to have we used to call it like an account on a page. And we had that consistently for every single client across the agency. So it was literally a 1-pager, and it, like some of those metrics that you talked about there, we'd, all very visual in terms of like, okay, yeah, so, depending on the different stakeholders, in terms of measuring our relationship, are we red, amber, green with this one? Are we, where do we need to focus in terms of, building that? How happy are they with, the range of services? This is everything that we currently deliver. What do they buy from us? What don't they? But oh my God, yeah, I would absolutely have loved to have added the narrative and the mindset.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting.
That is just so common. That
kind of under the surface.
Or we're that to them, they see us this way. And yeah, that's a really important way to do it. In terms of the strategic piece that you mentioned, Paddy, I think it's really obviously we focus very much on the people skills that the teams need in order to be able to do this stuff, to teach that strategic mindset piece. Lots of what we do feed into that around the asking questions, the listening, the being able to have good conversations, but there's probably something technical as well from within your agency, so your more experienced team that have that, and how do you knowledge share that with some of the more junior members of the team, how do they get exposed to that? How do they see the process that you go through? What models do you use? What process to help build and grow that technical capability alongside the softer side of it?
But I would advocate, sorry, I was just going to say one thing, but I would say this, right? So a bit like your point on being biased earlier, the measurement piece is important though. The reason I say that is that we do observe an optimism bias in agencies. There's often everything's okay, it will be fine. And whether that's a lack of listening and tuning in, or whether that's just a natural state, I think that measurement thing is important, because agencies are often quite surprised by client feedback, not always, but sometimes, because their radar isn't quite tuned in the way it might be. So I think that's why these plans being live, I think, and measured, however you choose to do that, and building that kind of culture of feedback around it, I think is important, so that you're not, it's not a nice plan, but it's not grounded in the real world. I think that's important.
Actually, that's really interesting, that optimism bias. How do you get agencies to actually be more realistic in their thinking of how clients view them? I know the data, and there's some questions I'm going to bring Stephen into the call in a bit, but there's some sort of that data side of things would be really important, but it also gives a realistic view. So actually, often, as you say, client agencies going cold with this unrealistic view of how clients view them, and then suddenly when they're shouted at and sort of the conversation turns against them, they don't know what to do. How would you go about helping them be more realistic?
Well, sometimes our job is to hold a mirror up, unfortunately. And that might be the data, which makes it very easy. And that might be their data, but it might also be, hundreds of thousands of benchmarks that we've got that say, actually, agency CEO, it may be that you want to grow in this area, but strategically, when clients are talking about you in this way, you are well under indexing versus the people that you're pitching against every day. So that we can be very confident in our provocation. There might be from the data, it might be from what we observe in working with them and the experience of working with them. I think that very often that's what we're doing, is holding a mirror up to say, actually, we think it's probably more fundamental. I was having a conversation just on Friday about a guy who wants to grow a large FMCG piece of business for a big network. And he was talking about, I want to grow here, I'm going to ask the client if we can get introductions in this market, this market, and this market. And my point to him was, you haven't got the basics in play. You don't have the equity, in my view, for that conversation yet. I think you can get there, of course you can, and let's talk about how you do that. But fundamentally, that conversation could backfire, because they're talking about some fairly fundamental steps and things that are not in play across your market. So your goodwill stocks are a bit low right now, so we would suggest kind of working on that before you get to that growth conversation. So I think, often our role is to challenge and provoke, but I think that's why measurement becomes important, because it becomes a bit unequivocal. As opposed to, it's not my opinion, it's what we can see.
I've got one more question before I'm going to open it up to the floor, but it's on this theme anyway, which actually is around conflict. And sort of, we've all experienced and worked with clients that are actually unpleasant to work with, who cause high amounts of churn in the agency, or actually or across through the agency, because actually client teams can't handle that person or that brand. So what advice can you give, Joe? I'm going to come to you first. What advice can you give to agencies and account teams how do you handle these toxic relationships? Are they actually worth handling, or actually is there steps you can take to start to make that change?
I was always advocate for them from being worth handling. Yeah, absolutely. In my experience, it can be incredibly hard, especially if that's a big fee generating client. It's a significant part of your portfolio. It can be very, very tempting to let that stuff slide and to accommodate. But the impact of that, both in terms of on your team, and actually probably I'd challenge you to look at the profitability of that as a client, if they're really that that hard to manage. So they should be the instigators to say, okay, right, yeah, I do need to address this issue. And as part of our program, we do a whole thing on conflict resolution, and there's a framework that people can step through to help them to do that. But starting point number one is explaining that there is a problem. So if they are frustrated, they're taking it out on your team, someone is going to need to go to that client and say, look, can we have a conversation here? You're clearly frustrated. You're finding things difficult. It's not working for us in the way that we'd like it to either. How can we find a solution that's going to work for both of us in this? And it's coming to it with an honest conversation from the off would be my starting point. What do you think, Emma?
Yeah, I was just going to say, the only step before that I always ask agencies who are in this boat is the question of intent. Does the agency have positive intent and genuine commitment to resolve this? Because it's going to take a lot of effort. Particularly if it's a bit of an entrenched cycle of kind of negativity. It's going to take a lot, and you have to ask that honestly, because it's not a quick fix. This is going to take some time to solve, and it may or may not be something you can solve directly. You may need intervention, which we also offer some agencies when things are really very bad. So I think, is there intent, but also, have you had a conversation with your client about positive intent? And I look back on my own agency days and think I was too scared to have that conversation a few times. And we spent an awful lot of time and money trying to fix something that was never fixable because the client wasn't with us. They didn't want us to succeed. And frankly, they were already looking for another agency over there while we were over investing and, all the rest of it, which, with hindsight, I was just too scared to have that conversation, which was, do you believe we can succeed? Are you willing for us to succeed? We are too. We want to put this work in, but are you there with us? And have that frank conversation. So I think that's the only thing, because I think without positive intent and commitment on both sides, you could spend an awful lot of time and money wasted. And then, of course, if they agree, then I'd echo everything that Joe has said, and I think also hold clients to account. I mean, I think that these things are rarely they're rarely born of one side, are they? They're going to be a series of contributions from both agency and client that are kind of misfiring in some way. So I think making sure that there's a degree of kind of level playing field about the plan and the conversation that's held, that means there's joint commitment and joint action to resolve, I think is really important and not often done enough.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in there, Paddy? To echo the words of both Emma and Joe, but the other thing I would say is that ultimately, we went into this business to do great work with people we actually wanted to work with, make a profit, develop our own agency and develop talent. So there's lots of good reasons. And actually, if you have a particularly nasty, difficult client, we've all met them in the past, then I think you have to be prepared to stick by your own standards and be prepared to walk away.
Mm-hmm.
If it's going to make people miserable, if it's going to actually mean that actually you can't do great work, ultimately that will reflect on your profitability. It's likely that actually, if you haven't got an engaged, happy, easy-ish to work client, then that reflects badly on you. Equally, too, I think it's very important to understand the culture that actually creates that individual, because it may well be something that actually doesn't actually sit on his shoulders or her shoulders. It actually resonates, and therefore removing that individual or calling that individual out, which you can do, of course. There's high risk associated with that, but you can do that. It could be actually that person isn't alone. There are people who are leaning on him and her, in turn, people are leaning on him and her further up the chain. So. Being aware of culture, understanding what you're getting yourself into when you actually engage with the client at the front end, and being prepared to walk away if it doesn't work out. Making sure there's a break clause in your contract after 6 months if you want to take it. It works both ways, and it is, as you said at the beginning of this meeting, this presentation, it's a relationship, and therefore it can't be a one-sided one.
Yeah. And we see that a bit more, actually. I mean, some agencies feel they can walk away, some don't, of course, depending on, the context and the size of the piece of business. But certainly I'm thinking about a number of examples lately around pitches or re-pitches, a number of our agency clients not stepping forward to pitch, deciding to walk away, or deciding that client is not a good fit for the business and the culture they want to create. So I think there is a little bit more of that happening. Something that we're hearing.
And I think there's a point in here as well around actually acting sooner rather than later, because typically if you win a new piece of business within a relatively short frame of time, the signs will be there. And actually, if you can have an honest conversation about that sooner rather than later, then you can prevent it getting to the point where you're going to have a really big difficult one. And actually, and probably before they've become so baked into your forecast and things that it's a bigger risk to be able to do that. But
I think
that's a great point, spotting the signs early.
And one thing, being direct, I think actually it's if you look at the way the Americans are, they are very, very direct and honest with that directness. So it's almost can be quite brutal, but actually it can break the relationship, but it can actually change the client's perspective. And I think that's sort of a key one. I'm going to bring in a couple more people. Annabelle, can you unmute? Because you've got a couple of questions, I believe. Where are you?
I will unmute, but I'm sorry I won't come on video. I'm still at the tail end of COVID, so I'm in my gym jams and looking grey. But thanks so much. I mean, Emma and Joe, I'm in your world in that we measure client relationship. That's our bag, and we're all about listening better and asking great questions. A few things, and in fact, Emma Lane has just asked a question around this about a percentage of time spent managing client relationships. I suppose I'd like to say, what would you suggest people put in their budget line for this? Because we have a budget line for everything, but when you come to talking to agencies about measuring client relationship, it's a vacuum.
That's really hard for me to answer, because I don't get to see often is the way that budgets are made up.
Okay.
In what we do. Obviously we talk a lot about FTE models and structures and remuneration very broadly, but I don't get to see the specifics, I suppose. Our job is more about how to make that time count.
Okay.
So I'm not sure I'm best. I don't know if you are, Joe. If you
well, I'm trying to, in terms of obviously how we would do it again, sort of previously. Obviously, depending on the cost of that person, if you're, looking to charge, how much of their time can you make chargeable for the time that's not chargeable that you're will then be invested in that client? How can you then quantify what the return on that is in terms of, okay, let's benchmark, how much revenue we've got from them this year. In terms of next year, we're looking to achieve this. So if we invest this time, what growth do we then get? So therefore, what's my return on investment if I put another full-time person into this? What and focus purely on that relationship side of things. What's then the impact of that? And there will be lots of benchmarks, and I'd encourage you actually to speak to. There'll be lots of lovely people in the Pimento network who I'm sure would be more than open to having conversations about, okay, well, yeah, what benchmarks have you got? How do you typically see that falling through? If you're spending this much, what do you get back on it in terms of revenue for clients, and seeing if you can come up with a formula that way, which you can then test and refine as you go through. But to Emma's point right at the start, there were undoubtedly investing in the relationships, and the data you said shows this will deliver in terms of increased revenue and growth.
Great stuff, thank you. And Emma Lane, can I just come back on your point you've put in the chat where you've said, do you have a steer on the split of time between account management versus PM time? I suppose my view, that I'd be interested in yours, Joe and Emma, is that actually account management and PM, there's a blurred line between the two. It's how you have those intelligent conversations when you're project managing that is account management, that can spot the new growth opportunities, or where there might be a latent grumbler. So I'm not sure I'd see it as a split of time, but more a case of enhancing and embedding those skills that, Joe, you were talking about. So that's my view on that. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, it's been a really good session.
Excellent. I think also just on the Emma, one of the things is actually project management is around delivering projects. The account management is actually about building strategic relationships. And actually, in the old days, they used to talk about it walking the corridors of the clients' businesses. And it's really getting to understand that side of things. So that actually takes more time to invest into that. So it's really working what's viable for your business. If that helps, Emma.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's always a challenge for us, the balance of you know, obviously the default for project managers is kind of, we're working on a project now, their focus is on that, but then you've kind of got clients who maybe not actively doing work on, so it's kind of, you know, the split of their time and how we can make sure that we're still keeping in touch with clients we've got that maybe we're not actively working on at this moment but could do in the future. And it's always that struggle of time, I suppose, that we find a challenge, and it's just how to best facilitate that, really, without having kind of dedicated account managers, which we currently don't have. But
it's tough because your project managers will always prioritize, and actually their primary role and function is to deliver on time, on budget, in scope. You know, that's sort of what you want them to do. So trying to carve out any time for them to do the relationship development piece, you've either got to be, you know, so intentional about, and actually then think about their skill set and what their preferences would be. So they're normally always just default to the delivery bit because that's what they're good and comfortable doing. So it's a tough one.
thanks.
I've got one last question, which is actually before I go back to the sort of final wrap up of this session. It's actually from Stephen, but it's a great question, which is around clients to look at. Everyone's talking about T-shaped people, and actually the diversity of channels now, it's really hard for agencies to be able to know everything but be so specialist. And actually, how do you get account handlers to be able to have the broadest sort of marketing knowledge but still have that I suppose that investment in their own specialism, understanding that depth of knowledge for that, but have a broader depth of knowledge to help clients across the board? And are there ways that we can incentivize account handlers to be able to develop all that? That's the broadest skill set possible.
I suppose it's whether it's realistic. I mean, how realistic, depending on the size of the organization and the depth of specialisms. I mean, the word which comes to mind to me is, and maybe this is truer of bigger agency organizations, is the behavior and the skill about influence, because these people, and it's kind of influence and collaboration and leadership, because actually it's not always possible to have a deep specialism on absolutely everything, but what you can do is have a great radar, you know, a great understanding of who to bring in, the ability to influence and collaborate with them to bring them in when is necessary. I think that's often what we see more at play in great account management on multidiscipline pieces of business. Not easy, but actually that's their skill in a way, is conducting the orchestra, and that requires excellent radar and excellent communication and team working skills. So that's maybe not the true definition of a T-shaped person, but often what we see at play in very integrated pieces of business.
Yeah, I think, and I've certainly seen that at play and work very successfully, because I think you're right, getting both is probably, you'll be really lucky in order to do or to achieve that. And actually, investing more in that, certainly on your client service side of things, in the broader piece with that radar, knowing, understanding, okay, when do I bring my specialist in? You know, have I got this opportunity to the point where actually, you know, we need that level of detail. There's more credibility in it that way, it seems to me. And that's what builds your trust.
I also think it's around actually that sort of the partnership side of things, and actually knowing and having great specialist partners that you can bring in and refer, and understanding the client's agency sort of world as well, and who are the agencies, where are they struggling, where are they having issues, and actually be able to say, actually, this isn't an investment for us, it's an investment for you, and bring the extra value to that relationship, which is, we know a partner who's we trust and have worked with, and can bring them to the table. So it's really about sort of how do you build not only your client understanding, but also your partner understanding, so that you can really invest into that client and give better value back.
Understanding your client's problem and giving them options to solve it. If you wanted to, you know, boil it like right down, that's what you need your client service team to be able to do.
Great. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask one last question from my perspective, which is, if there is one key thing agencies should be doing right now to help actually have more successful growth plans and agency relationships, what should they do? I'm going to start with you, Emma. The broadest question possible.
One thing. It would probably be listen. Listen in all senses of the word. Go out and listen. You know, we often talk about listen as an action and listen as an intervention in its own right, particularly when a client's unhappy. The first step is, of course, to go and speak to them about it and understand and map their experience in a kind of sophisticated way. And I think that we often talk about that is, you know, that's key to understanding anyway, but particularly if you're in a problematic relationship or you're wanting to grow, it's really important, I think, just to go in and what does that say about you, and, you know, as a symbol of care and commitment and interest and drive and all those things. So I think it's a very simple one, but I think it would be to go out and listen more. And I don't think agencies are good at it. That's the other reason I say that. I think because we're all ex-agency or, you know, or still in agencies here, are a bit more primed to broadcast and sell. We don't have those skills unless they're taught. So I'd say that.
When in our program we talk about the difference between listening to respond and listening to understand.
Yeah, so Stephen
and
Covey,
the majority of the time we are all in that first camp. We're listening, but we're already formulating what it is that we're gonna say, and yeah, being able to have that skill to practice it is being truly listened to will improve your client relationships, probably as I say, beyond measure, but we're all about the measurement. So it would be brilliant to take a score at this point, teach them all how to properly listen, and then measure again and see what that impact is.
We'll have to have another session about listening.